皆様に注意事項を申し上げますので、よろしくお願いいたします。まず携帯電話、スマートフォンの電源を切るかですね、マナーモードにして音が出ないようにしてください。それから撮影なんですが、報道関係者の方以外は、ご遠慮ください。それから会場内でのチラシの配布、署名集めなどはこれもご遠慮ください。それから受付で受け取った胸から下げる名札なんですが、これはぜひ胸からつけてください。よろしくお願いします。あとですね、その今お話した名札なんですが、明日以降も国際会議にご参加の方は領収済みの確認ができますので、そのままお持ち帰りいただいてですね、また明日以降お持ちください。本日のみのご参加の方は終了時にお帰りの際受付に返却してください。それからまた明日のですね、国際会議で同日薬機を貸し出しいたします。その際、保証金として1000円をお預かりしますけれども、返却の際にお返ししますので、ご了承ください。以上、よろしくお願いいたします。それでは第4回市民科学者国際会議プレイベント特別講演に入ります。まず講師の紹介をいたします。京都大学原子炉実験所の小出弘明さんです。小出さんは1949年生まれです。1972年東北大学原子核工学科を卒業され、1974年東北大学大学院工学研究科原子核工学修士課程を修了され、その後京都大学原子炉実験所に採用されました。小出さんは学生時代にですね、女川原子力発電所反対運動にも参加されてましたし、京都大学原子炉実験所に就職されてからは学内で有志で研究所内の有志とともにですね、皆さんもご存知だと思いますけれども、熊取6人衆と呼ばれるグループを作りまして、原子力推進ではなく原子力の危険性を研究し、また反対の活動をされてこられました。2011年3月11日の福島第一原子力発電所の事故の後は、北海道から沖縄まで全国を駆け巡って原発の危険性と原発の即時廃止を訴えてこられました。それでは小出さん、よろしくお願いいたします。
皆さんこんにちは。この国際会議は明日、明後日と2日間にわたって重要な発表がたくさんあるようです。私もその会議に参加したいと思ってはいたのですが、申し訳ありませんが、私はまた柏崎に行ったりしなければいけなくて、明日からの会議には参加できません。ただ、明日からのたくさんの個別というか多様な問題の議論の前に、福島で起きたことがどういうことなのかということを、プレイベントとして皆さんにお伝えするようにというふうに求められましたので、私の今日聞いていただきたいのは、資料の中にこんなのが挟まれていると思います。福島第一原子力発電所事故の過去、現在、未来ということで、これまでに起こったこと、そして今何が問題になっているのか、そしてこれから何十年、あるいは何百年にわたってどういうことをやらなければいけないのかということを聞いていただこうと思います。早速話を始めたいと思います。こちら側に日本語のパワーポイントがありますし、向こうに英語に直してくださったパワーポイントがありますので、どちらでも皆さん見やすいところを見ていただけたらと思います。タイトルがこれでした。 番右にあるこれが1号機です。2011年3月11日に運転中でした。そして地震と津波に襲われて原子炉が溶け落ちてしまって発生してきた水素で爆発が起きて原子炉建屋の最上階の基礎にこれ、このまま見るとなんか2階建てのように皆さん見えるかもしれませんが、ここは1階でこういう大きな体育館のような背の高い空間で最上階が吹き飛んで骨組みだけになってしまう。次の隣にあるのが2号機。ここも当日運転中でやはり原子炉が溶け落ちてしまいましたが、見ていただける通りこの2号機は原子炉建屋がまだ姿が
But you can see that compared to Unit 1, the Unit 2 has the external wall that is remaining. And why didn't a hydrogen explosion happen in Unit 2? Well, you can see that there's a bit of a hole in the surface wall, which is called blowout panel. Technological terminology. The panel is removed automatically when there's an issue inside, and because the panel was removed, it vented out the interior of the Unit 2 and prevented the hydrogen explosion. But however, the Unit 2 actually had the most emission of the radioactive particles according to the government and TEPCO. The next unit is Unit 3. Again, that was in operation on March 11th. The core meltdown happened. Hydrogen explosion occurred. Explosion happened on the very top floor of the facility. That blew the top facilities off. The explosion was so great on Unit 3 that even the external wall of the facility is no longer there. The external walls and pillars have been destroyed and scattered around. And on the very left-hand side, you see the Unit 4. Unit 4 was not in operation on March 11th. There was no core that was in Unit 4, so a core meltdown did not occur. But that said, the hydrogen explosion occurred on Unit 4 as well, blowing off the roof and the top part of this facility, as you can see on this picture. You might notice if you look very carefully that in case of Unit 1, only the top structure, top layer exploded and was blown away. The wall remained. In case of Unit 3, the top floor was scattered and completely demolished, but you see the lower floor. But in case of Unit 4, you see even greater damage. Not only the top floor, but only the lower floor and lower walls has been demolished. As I said before, the Unit 4 was not in operation. The core was not in the facility at that time. So where was the fuel? All the fuels were in a spent fuel pool underneath the water. Where was the spent fuel pool? It was on the very lower part of this Unit 4, where you see the empty space without the wall. That was where the spent fuel was, with a tremendous amount of spent fuels, which is suspended in a way within this unit. This has led to the scattering of an enormous amount of radioactive particles. In case of nuclear power operation, how much radioactive particles do we need to generate, and how much of the radioactive particles do we have to face? That's what I'd like to talk about now. On the white side, the white area, I'd like to make a very small square. Well, you will see that on the English version already. This very square here is what I am drawing right now on the screen, which is the equivalent of the amount of uranium-235 that is fissioned in the Hiroshima bombing, which was only 800 grams. 800 grams is equivalent of something that you can hold within one palm, and you can even lift it. With the fission of the atomic bomb, A bomb, equivalent of 800 grams, it was enough to destroy the entire city of Hiroshima.
そのエネルギーを原爆というような形ではなくて、人類の平和のために使えないか。
Of course, I came to think and had hope for the nuclear power for usage for the purpose of peace and civilization rather than for a bomb, and that's why I was studying this field. But if we were to undertake nuclear power generation, how much fission of the same uranium-235 is necessary? This is the amount, which is 1 ton. 1,000 megawatt is the basic equivalent of the regular nuclear power plant, and for that, 1 ton of uranium-235 need to be fissioned. So 3,000 times the amount that was fissioned in the Hiroshima bombing is necessary. Firstly, means that a tremendous amount of fuel is necessary, and the fact that this much of the uranium is consumed in every nuclear power plant unit would mean that we will deplete the uranium resources around in the entire world quite soon. 800-gram fission means, first of all, means that you would generate 800 grams equivalent of radioactive particles are generated. That same goes for 1 ton. You will be releasing 1 ton worth of radioactive particles that is released in just 1 year. For 1 year of the nuclear power plant operation, a power plant generates 1,000 times the radioactive substances of the uranium that was released at the time of A bombing in Hiroshima. Earlier, I said that 1 million kilowatt or 1,000 megawatts is the general, the average power generation in a nuclear power plant. I am talking about the power generation, which is different and which is actually 3 times higher than this 1,000 megawatt of the power or the heat that is generated within the nuclear power plant. Only 1/3 generates the actual electricity and power, which means that most of it, 2/3 of it, are not used and are just released and dumped into the ocean. It is heating up the seawater, which is quite meaningless. And furthermore, another element that I'd like to add to this picture is the following. The heat that is generated from within such nuclear power plant that is not directly as a result of the uranium fission. That part only is 2,690 megawatts. So what's the remaining part? And that's what we call as decay heat. Earlier, I said that the nuclear power plant generates and accumulates a tremendous amount of fuels. Nuclear power plant generates radioactivity, and the fuel continue to release heat within the power plant, and that's what we call decay heat. With the decay heat within the average power plant is equivalent of 210 megawatts. Can you imagine what 210 megawatt represents? You probably have a small stove or a heater or other devices at home. These devices generate about 1 kilowatt. So, which means that 210,000 times that small devices that you use at home is the equivalent of the decay heat that is generated.
Nuclear Regulation Authority. So the head of the NRA
share this information.
比較的小さな原子力
Fukushima
発電
Daiichi nuclear power plant is actually quite small.
小さな
The
原
size
子炉
is
そこが運転を停止してから東海熱というものがどれだけ残っているか、あるいはどれだけ残っていってくれるかというものを田中俊一さんが書いたのがこの線。
If you look at this
下
curve,
に
this
0、
shows how much
24、48、72と書いてありますが、
is
これは原
evaporated.
子炉を
You
止めた
see 0, 24,
時から
48,
の
72 at
時
the
間で
bottom.
す。
And this
24時間後、
indicates
48
the number of
時間
hours
つま
after
り1日後、2日後、3日後
the reactor was stopped. So this is day 1, day 2, day 3.
比較的小さな福島第一原子力
Even
発電
with
所1
Fukushima
号機で
Daiichi
あって
NPP,
も
which was relatively small,
事故から3日目
the reactor number 1,
になったところでなお1分間に140リッターの水を蒸発させるだけ誤
it
解が
stopped. There's enough decay heat
お分かり
to
になります。
evaporate
多分皆さん
140
家
liters
庭
of
の
water
浴槽
every minute.
は100リッター、200リッタ
So
ー
I think that your bathtub at home probably
その
holds about
浴槽
100
の
or
水が
200 liters.
1分ごとに蒸発して
So
な
every
くなってい
minute,
くほどの
the whole
熱を
bathtub full
3
of
日
water
経って
is
もなお
evaporating.
出している
And even 3 days after the reactor is stopped, there's still enough
その
heat
熱
to
を
evaporate
除去
that
で
much
きなけ
water
れば
at that
も
much
ちろん原子力
at that speed.
という当たり前のことな
And
の
of
で
course,
で
if
それ
the
が実
reactor
際に
cannot
起き
be
て
cooled
し
down,
まった
then the reactor will melt. And that's exactly what happened.
1号機から3号機当日運転中だったので
Units 1 to 3 were in operation
地震に
that
襲われ
day,
ました。
and they were
東京
struck
電
by
力
the
はすぐ
earthquake.
に原子炉の運転を止めました。
TEPCO
つまり
stopped
自分
operating
で
the
はもう発電ができない
reactors immediately. So these reactors
そ
were
うい
no
う時
longer
には
capable
外
of
部の
generating
送電
power,
線から電気を
meaning
もらう
that they needed to
こ
get
とになっていたのですが
power from an
外部
external
の送電
source.
線も地震でみんなひっくり返ってしまって
All of the
電気を
power
送ってくれ
cables
なくなりました
were wrecked
そういう
by the
時にも
earthquake.
実
They
は
were no
備え
longer
があ
able
る
to get
東京電力
external
は
power. Now, TEPCO
敷
had
地の
claimed
中
that they
に
would still
非
be
常用
able to
の
get
水の
power
発
in
電機を
those
たくさん置いてあるから
situations,
それ
that
が
they
電
had
気を供
emergency
給して
backup
くれる
diesel power
ように
generators
思っ
on
ていた
site. And
し
they
か
had
しその
assumed that
ディーゼ
these
ル発
backup
電機も
generators
全景を
would kick
津
in.
波でやられ
However,
てしまい
all
ま
of
して
these power generators
できない
were
つ
rendered
まり自分では発電できない
immobile
外部
due
から
to
も
the
電気が
tsunami.
もらえない
So
非常
no
用の発電機
self-generating
も動かない
power, no
ということ
power
で
could be supplied from the
電
outside.
子系で
And
私た
then
ちはフラット
the
アウトと
emergency
いう状態に追い込ま
power
れています
generators also failed, which
でも
meant
原子
that
炉
it
の
was
中
in
で
a
は
complete
熱が
power
出ている
blackout.
それを冷やそうと思えば水を送るしかないわけで
But
すけれ
there's
ど
still
も
heat
水
in
を
the
送るため
reactors,
にはポンプが回ら
so
なけ
you
れば
need to continue
ポ
supplying
ンプ
water.
を回すた
But
め
in
には
order to
電気
supply
がなけ
water,
れば
you need
いけませ
the
ん
pumps to
しかし
move.
その電気が
And in order to move
そう
the
なれば
pumps, you
ポン
need
プが
power,
回るから
but
水
there's
も
no
回る
power.
結
So
局
no
原子
power
炉
means
が
no pumping, means no water supply,
ということになって
means
しま
no
う
removal of heat, and
これ
therefore
が原子力
the
発電
reactor has no choice
断
but to
面
melt.
縦の断
Here's a
面
section
です
of the power
真ん
reactor.
中に薬のカプセルのようなものが縦
In
に
the
書い
middle,
て
you see
あります
something
が
that looks
こ
like
れが
a
私たちが原
pill.
子炉圧力容器
This is what we call the
凍
reactor
結性
pressure
の圧力
vessel.
釜
This is basically
福島
a
第一原
steel
子力発電所の場合には厚さ
pressure vessel.
16センチあるという厚い
In
凍
Fukushima.
結性の釜
This was a very
そ
thick
の中に
steel
水が張
structure,
ってあっ
16
て
centimeters
真ん
thick.
中にゴシンと私たち
And
が
then
入れ
there
てい
is
る
water that is filled
でここ
inside,
でウラ
and
ン
then
が
the reactor
含んで
core
い
is
て
inside
熱
of
が
that.
出て
So this
熱
is
が
where
沸騰して
the
タービン
nuclear
に
fission
送られ
occurs,
て
creating
タービ
heat,
ンを回
sending
した
steam to the turbines,
というの
and
が
the turbines
通常
create
運転
electricity. So that's
しか
what
し
happens
地
during
震
the
に襲わ
normal
れて運転を停
operation.
止した
However,
ですからもう
the
発電はでき
earthquake
なくなった
caused
わけですが
the reactor
こ
to
の部
stop.
分に
It
は
is no
大
longer
型な
generating
放射
power,
性物質
but
がすでに溜まっていて
already in the
発電
center
を
there is
続け
a
る
lot of
ということ
radioactive
です
substances.
何としてもここを冷やさなければいけないわけ
So
で
the
す
reactor
けれ
core
ども
has
冷
to
やせない
be cooled down, but
ここは
they lost the means
溶けるときには
to cool this
ウ
part,
ランはペレットという
and
私
this
たちが呼
part
んでいる
melted.
瀬戸物に焼き固めてあります直径1センチ高さ1
is
センチほどの
formed
小指の
into
先ぐらいの瀬戸物に焼き固めて
This
あり
is
ます
actually a
が
very small pellet,
そのペレットを約400個
like a ceramic piece.
燃料棒
There are about 400 of these pellets,
物
which
細い
are
物質弾のような
made into like
棒の中に詰めてあるのですがその棒
laundry
は
rod
ジルコニウムという金属で
in
できています
a
このジルコ
long
ニウム
cylinder,
は
and
850度から900度になる
this
と
uses
周りの水と反応する
zirconium fuel
cladding. When this reaches 800 degrees, then it starts to melt. And when it melts, then a lot of hydrogen was being created. Now, if you look at the diagram, I think you can all realize that around the reactor pressure vessel, there's a kind of an experimental flask. So there's a flask outside of the reactor pressure vessel, which we are calling the reactor containment vessel. The reactor containment vessel is designed to capture everything so that no radiation can escape. Obviously, no radiation gets out, no air gets out, no water gets out. At least that was the design. However, due to the severity of the accident, we believe that even the reactor containment vessel was damaged in many areas. Therefore, the hydrogen started to escape from the reactor containment vessel. Hydrogen is a very lightweight gas, and it accumulated at the top part of the building, therefore leading to an explosion here. So the hydrogen led to this explosion. Due to the explosion, obviously the radioactive substances that were also in this area were spewed into the atmosphere. And the same happened for units 1 to 3. The reactor core melted and fell down. They said that the uranium is baked into a ceramic-like piece, and that will not melt unless the temperature exceeds 2800, but that ended up melting. This reactor pressure vessel is made out of steel, but that will melt after the temperature exceeds 1400 to 1500. So at that high of a temperature, even the reactor containment vessel bottom fell out, and the reactor core fell even further. You see there's a little bit of space at the bottom. This is what we call the pedestal. So the reactor core fell to this part, which is what we're calling the pedestal. And then what happened was, now according to TEPCO, there's a concrete inner floor on the pedestal, and on the concrete, the ceramic piece fell. The ceramic piece was 2800 degrees, so it started to eat into the cement. However, according to TEPCO, the cement here is 1 meter thick. They said that it was gouged out up to 70 centimeters, but there was still 30 centimeters remaining. And when I heard that explanation, I wanted to ask them, did you actually go and see that? Have you seen that for yourselves? Nobody is able to access the site. Nobody can go into the reactor building, let alone inside of the reactor containment vessel. It will soon be 4 years since the accident, and to this day, nobody is able to go to the site. So the accident is that harmful. My assumption is that perhaps this floor has already been damaged by the melted uranium. This also had a maintenance access for people, and there's a possibility that the melted uranium has escaped from that hatch, and I have a fear that even the reactor containment vessel steel has been damaged by the uranium. The other issue is Unit 4. As we said earlier, Unit 4 was not in operation during the day of the accident. All of the fuel was here. It was stored here in what is called the spent fuel pool. The reactor containment vessel was built to contain all of the radiation, but the spent fuel pool is outside of that, meaning that the spent fuel pool has nothing around it to contain radiation. So the top ceiling has already been blown off, and the wall around this pool has also been destroyed. There is a huge amount of fuel inside of this pool, and unless this pool is cooled, the whole reactor would be in danger of melting down. Shunsuke Kondo was the head of the Nuclear Regulation Commission at that time. He said in a report that if the water in the spent fuel pool were to evaporate and the fuel were to be exposed to the air, then He said that there would be so much radioactive substances in the atmosphere that even Tokyo would become uninhabitable, meaning that there was that much spent fuel in this pool. In the case of Unit 4, there was no fuel in the reactor core, therefore the reactor core did not melt, and that was fortunate. However, inside of a half-wrecked reactor building, the spent fuel pool became suspended in the air, and it contained enough fuel that was the equivalent to 14,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs. And it had the cesium-137, which I believe is one of the most harmful radioactive substances for living organisms. Here's reactors 3 and 4. If you look at reactor 3, you see that the whole top floor has been blown off, and even the skeleton is crumbling. But you see that at the very bottom there is still a wall that is intact, whereas reactor 4, the top floor has been blown off, and then even at the bottom you see that the ground floor level has been blown off. Where my laser pointer is right now, right behind is where the spent fuel pool is built. This is also a photo of Unit 4. And look at this photo from the north side. The earlier photo was from the ocean, so you saw that all of the walls had been destroyed. And on the land side as well, the walls have been destroyed. Now, on this side, you see that some of the wall is intact. And right behind this wall, which is still there, is where the spent fuel pool is. Now, to explain what is happening here, you see desperate efforts being made to fill the pool with water. You may recall that after the accident, the self-defense forces went to Fukushima Daiichi NPP in a helicopter. They flew over it. You may recall what they were trying to do. Here's the spent fuel pool, and we knew that it would be a catastrophe if the water evaporated. So the SDF helicopter flew over the reactor, and they dropped water over the building, hoping that it would hit the pool. But the self-defense forces were afraid. They could not get close to the building, so they dumped water from a very high altitude, and none of that water reached the pool. The Tokyo Fire Department, after that, went to the same site, and they used a fire hose truck aiming to get water into the fuel pool. But again, the Tokyo Fire Department people were not able to get close, so they were aiming to get the water in from a far away distance. And the water in the pool continued to evaporate. So at the very end, this is what they used. This is a high-reach concrete pump car. We call it kirin, which is the Japanese word for giraffe. It has a very long, extended arm, and finally, after using this apparatus, they were able to fill the pool and prevent the spent fuel pool in Unit 4 from evaporating. So, Unit 4 was able to avoid a catastrophic situation in which even Tokyo would have become uninhabitable. Even though Unit 4 didn't melt down, Units 1 to 3 had their reactor cores melted down, so already a tremendous amount of radioactive substances had been released into the atmosphere. Now, in front of me is a white canvas, and I'd like to show you how much radioactive substances have been released. The IAEA received a report from the Japanese government, and inside of the government, they show values showing how much cesium-137 has been released into the atmosphere. So cesium-137, as I said earlier, out of the nuclear fission substances, I believe that this is the most dangerous and harmful for mankind. And nuclear fission substances amount to around 200. There's cesium-137, and there's also strontium-90, or plutonium-239, and xenon-234, iodine, 131 and other nuclear substances. And out of all of those, I believe that cesium-137 is the most dangerous to mankind.
So I'd like to use cesium-137 as a basis to look at the situation. First of all, again, I'm writing a very small square on the left-hand side. This was the amount of cesium-137 that was released into the atmosphere with the mushroom cloud at the time of Hiroshima A bombing, using the terabecquerel as the unit. So it's 89 terabecquerel, but then you might not understand how much that is. So therefore, please understand that this yellow square is a representative of an equivalent of the release of cesium-137 at the time of A bombing in Hiroshima. Well, how was the case in the Fukushima power plant? Just the Unit 1 has released 590 terabecquerel of cesium-137 according to the Japanese government, and the worst case was in Unit 2. Which released this much amount into the atmosphere, and it caused a tremendous explosion, so much so that it couldn't even keep the building. And Unit 3 also released this much. So putting all these 3 units together, it's 168 bombs equivalent to the Hiroshima bombs, according to the Japanese government. One A-bomb amount of cesium-137 or radioactive particles is extremely scary and dangerous. But now we are talking about 168 times the A-bomb at the time of Hiroshima. According to the Japanese government, we are only talking about the atmospheric release. Later on, I will be covering about the other type of releases. For example, the contaminated water containing the radioactive substances that is released as we speak from the power plant. So hundreds of times of the A-bomb Hiroshima was released because of the power plant disaster in Fukushima, and we are not able to stop this. What happens to the radioactive substances that is released? They actually flow with the wind flow. In Japan, we are in the northern hemisphere, in climate where we have the prevailing wind called prevailing westerlies, which is extremely powerful. Of course, near the ground we have westerlies as well as easterlies and other type of winds, but on the higher part of the atmosphere, westerlies is prevailing. What happened according to this climate conditions of the radioactive substance releases? This is what happened. We are here in Japan, right here, and you can see that the strength of the level of radioactivity is expressed and color-coded. So blue means less and red means higher radioactive release. As you can see here, the red dot is where Fukushima and Tohoku region lies. Around that, you see the yellow part, which is Kanto and Tohoku region, and which represents a massive area. But you can see that in case of Hokkaido or in the western part of Japan and Kyushu area, you can see the color is blue, which means that the radioactive releases from the Fukushima power plant did not reach as much these areas. Right after the March 11th, I got many phone calls asking me for advice, and some of them said that they are too scared to live within Japan, that they are ready to flee abroad. However, if they lived in Hokkaido or in the western part of Japan, then they see that actually, and if they flee to the United States, for example, or North America, they would be faced with even higher radioactivity, as you can see on this map. Can you imagine that a particular plant or power plant in Japan that caused accident, that causes contamination in the Northern America? This is the characteristic of a nuclear power plant accident, as displayed by this map. But of course, the situation is extremely serious in Japan, especially around Tohoku and Kanto area, where we perceived a great amount of radiation contamination. The Japanese government has also released a map of contamination, which is this one. You can see the Fukushima power plant right here in Hamadori, facing the Pacific Ocean in Fukushima Prefecture. On the left, the eastern part of the power plant, we have the Pacific Ocean, and the prevailing westerlies would blow out the radiation contamination towards the sea. But then, we also have some days where we have the southern winds or northern wind or easterlies as well, which means that the radioactive substances were scattered in different areas. On some days, there was a northern wind, winds coming from the north, which brought the radioactive substances to southward, contaminating Ibaraki and northern, especially northern Ibaraki area. And the cloud, the plume, actually went to Kasumigawara area as well, right here. And it has also contaminated the northern Chiba and even the downtown area in some parts of Tokyo. In some cases, the wind came from southeastern direction, which means that the radioactive plume went on the northern and western direction. As you can see the color of yellow and green shades, where you can see the area of very high contamination, which is considered currently a controlled area where inhabitants are not able to go in and live back where they are from. They have lost their homelands and their whole livelihood and their living was destroyed. This is represented by the yellow, green, and red part on this map. Why did this happen? Well, because there was a snowfall and rain at the time of the accident. You remember a Japanese novel called Black Rain, which talks about the mushroom cloud at the time of Hiroshima A bomb that actually brought the radioactive particles through the clouds, through the rain, and leaving black stain and streaks on the walls, on the white walls of houses in Hiroshima area, which caused further and secondary irradiation and contamination. That's what the Black Rain, the novel, talks about. And similar things happened in this area as well because of the rain and snowfall. You would see two circles, dotted circles here around Fukushima, which shows the 20-kilometer radius as well as 30-kilometer radius around the Fukushima power plant. 20-kilometer radius was indicated as evacuation area according to the Japanese government. The Japanese government dispatched buses so people can evacuate. But for the 30-kilometer radius, they could not do anything. So therefore, they have ordered people to, if they need to evacuate, they need to evacuate by themselves. But if otherwise, they should stay at home and not go outside. That was the only indications and orders that was given by the Japanese government, and nothing else was said by the Japanese government. But you can see that the contamination did not remain within 20 or 30-kilometer radius. It went beyond that to 40, 50, 60, and 70, which includes Iitate village of Fukushima Prefecture. They don't receive any benefits or profits from the nuclear power plant. They were quite self-reliant historically, that they have created, and they were even called the most beautiful village in Japan. But however, because of an accident that took place randomly one day, they were extremely contaminated. However, the government did not provide any support to the people of Iitate. People of Iitate were not notified of the danger or risk. Only after 1 month that had the Japanese government given finally indication that your village is extremely indicated. That's what has happened, and where people has left the area basically. But the contamination did not stop there. You can see the blue line that is drawn from the north to south of Fukushima Prefecture, which is called Nakadori area of Fukushima Prefecture. You have Abukuma mountainous regions in the south, and on the west you have the Oi mountain ranges, which means that Nakadori is a flat land which is kind of sandwiched by two mountain ranges, which is a very favorable environment for habitation. So a lot of population resided there. Koriyama, Tsukagawa, Shirakawa, and other villages and towns actually are all located in Nakadori. So it's all the population concentration area of Fukushima Prefecture that were all in Nakadori. But the contamination actually happened between these two mountain ranges, unfortunately. That radiation also spread to Gunma Prefecture and Tochigi Prefecture on the northern sides as well. In between Nagano and Gunma Prefecture, there is also some mountain ranges that are quite high, which means that the cloud, the plume, could not go over these mountain ranges, which means that they actually lined these mountain ranges to go downward to Okutama region in Tokyo. In terms of the level of contamination, you can see the color-coded chart on the bottom of this map. Of course, red means the highest, yellow, green, and so forth. And blue and the very light green part is seen in Aizu area in Fukushima, Gunma Prefecture, or Iwate Prefecture, and even a bit of Tokyo as well as other regions. These are very light green is where we have seen 13 to 60 tons of megabecquerel per square meters. For blue area, it's over 60,000 becquerel of contamination, again, according to the Japanese government. So what does these numbers represent? That's what I'd like to talk about now. As I said before, I am at the Kyoto University, and I work day-to-day on the basis with the nuclear and faced with radiation. You would think that I work in Kyoto because I work for Kyoto University. That's not the case. That's not where I work, because, as you can see, I need to be working in a reactor, a very small reactor indeed, but it has, so because I work in the Curie or Kyoto University Research Reactor institutions. Of course, even a small reactor cannot be built within Kyoto, so we could not have that facility within Kyoto. So since then, Kyoto University endeavored to build or find a location for the test reactor, but because there are inhabitants everywhere in Japan, the Kyoto University has been rejected continuously, and finally we found a place in Kumatori village in Osaka Prefecture, which is basically close to Wakayama Prefecture. The facility is within the 100,000 kilometers, and we have several test reactors within this premise. But when we are dealing with radioactive particles and substances, there is a strict regulations on where we can handle these radioactive substances. Even within this massive premise, we can only handle or locate radioactive substances in a very small area, a very defined area, which is called radiation control area. Because of my work, I can go in, and I need to go into radiation control area, but you will not be able to, and ordinary citizens or inhabitants will not be able to enter this area. Even for myself, who is an expert in this area, I am not allowed to even drink a sip of water within the control area, nor eat anything. There is no restrooms or bathrooms, so I cannot exit, which means that a radiation control area can be defined as a place where people cannot inhabit. It's for a particular, people enter for specific purposes for work, and they need to evacuate immediately once they're done. There is an entrance of the control area which is always shut and closed, because if there is a free entry and free flow of people within the area and outside from the area, that person who entered the control area might be contaminated and cause secondary contamination of people outside. So when you exit from the radiation control area, the personnel must be measured beforehand if there is any contamination in their body or in their hands before the door opens. There are certain criteria for the doors to open, which is a certain level. So if my vest is contaminated over 40,000 becquerel per square meter, then the only thing I can do is to remove the suit immediately and discard of the suit immediately. If the radiation level is 40,000 becquerel per square meter, then even if the certain device or equipment is extremely expensive, then I must discard of that device immediately. If my hand is contaminated at the same level, then I will not be able to open the door and leave the facility. I need to wash my hand at the decontamination area or room. If water doesn't remove it, I need to use hot water. If that is not sufficient, I would need to use certain liquid or detergents. If that is not does not remove it, I need to use chemical even if my skin gets burned down. That's what we're talking about, and the limit is 40,000 square meter per becquerel.
This is about something in a completely different dimension. The whole land has been contaminated. We are in Yoyogi of Tokyo today. This is a relatively uncontaminated area. So this building is not heavily contaminated. Try to imagine if we were in Hiroshima, the entire building is contaminated by radiation, and if you step outside the garden is contaminated, the road is contaminated, all of the buildings around us would be contaminated. Even if we opened out to the suburbs, then the entire area would be contaminated. The mountains would be contaminated. Everything would need to be considered a radiation control area, or it's actually the contamination is even more severe than what you would see in the radiation control area. So to be quite honest, the district of Hiroshima as well as Miyagi and Ibaraki, northern part, Tochigi, northern part Chiba, northern part and Iwate, as well as Niigata, some parts of Saitama, and even some parts of Tokyo would need to be considered a radiation control area. We're talking about 14,000 square kilometers. In terms of population, we would be affecting close to 10 million people. That is my guess. So we will be looking at some more cesium information, but I will show you a distribution of where the cesium fell. Sawano-san is an acquaintance of mine, and he did some very careful calculations to identify how much cesium had fallen on each prefecture. Here's a diagram that corresponds to the same information. So the Japanese government has said that the cesium-137 released into the atmosphere is here, 15,000 terabecquerels. This is 168 bombs, or Hiroshima A bombs, the equivalent of. And we will look at the distribution of that fallout. Obviously, Fukushima has the biggest deposit, and then Tochigi, Gunma, Ibaraki, and then Miyagi Prefecture. Here's Iwate, and then Chiba, and then a few more. So several prefectures in Japan have been contaminated. This is the deposit for Japan. The balance went to the Pacific Ocean. So if you think about what fell on Japan, is roughly 2,400 terabecquerels. So out of the overall 15,000 terabecquerels, then approximately 16% landed in Japan. The remainder, 84%, went to the Pacific Ocean and basically contaminated Northern America. So as you heard, 15,000 terabecquerels of cesium-137 was released into the atmosphere. This is according to the Japanese government. And in the Tohoku area, 2,400 terabecquerels fell in the Tohoku area. So how does that feel to you? Is it possible for you to get a realization of the amount of radiation? I think it might be hard, but when you say 2,400 terabecquerels, 2,400 terabecquerels caused enough damage that would warrant Tohoku to be a radiation-controlled area. But then if you were to convert that into weight, how much do you think that would be? The entire amount that was generated would be 4.7 kilograms in weight. So large amounts of the country of Japan would need to be considered a radiation-controlled area, and it would have to do that because of the amount of radiation that converted to weight is only 4.7 kilograms. You say that it is impossible to sense radiation, and I think that you certainly agree. Well, why do you think that's the case? We say radiation. When we say radiation, or hoshano in Japanese, we're talking about radioactive substances. These are substances, meaning they have a form, they have a color, they probably have a smell. But why can we not sense it using our five senses? If there was enough radiation for us as humans to sense it, then we would die instantly. This very small amount of cesium, small in weight, has contaminated an entire region in large parts of this country. So we are engaging in a battle against this type of substance. This is something that has already happened in the past. And now I would like to talk a little bit about what we will be doing for the future. In 2011, in Japan, the Democratic Party was in power. Naoto Kan was the prime minister, was the then prime minister. He fell out of grace, and Noda became the next prime minister. And in December of 2012, Noda declared that the situation was under control. I was shocked. I felt like telling him, this is nothing to joke about. As I said earlier, units 1 to 3 that were in operation on March 11, 2011, their reactor cores had melted down. Nobody still knows in what state they are, where they are at. If it was a thermal reactor that had had an accident, it's much easier to respond to. Maybe there would have been a fire that raged for several days, but then after that, people could go in. You could find out what happened. In some cases, you could even repair it. But in the case of a nuclear power accident, even 3 years and 8 months after the accident, nobody can gain access to the site, because if a person were to go there, that would spell instant death. It is that dangerous. They're trying to make it possible to collect information with robots, but robots do not do well under radiation. The robots have gotten lost and unable to return back. So it has been extremely difficult to understand what is happening inside. And if the reactor cores were to melt further, that would mean more radioactive substances in the air. So even though they have no idea where the reactor core is, where the meltdown is, they have been pumping the reactors full of water continuously. Now, the water will become contaminated water. It's contaminated with radiation, of course. So today, there is a continuing, the amount of contaminated water has continued to increase on a daily basis. Even today, about 5,000 workers, I believe, are working somewhere on site, battling radiation at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. These workers are not employed by TEPCO. They are subcontractors or maybe subcontractors. They actually have 8, 9, 10 subcontractors. And of course, each middleman will take a margin, so the people working for the very bottom tier subcontractor will not even be making minimum wage, and yet they are the ones who are battling radiation. And think, how many decades more will we need to continue to engage in this? Nobody has any idea. And already, large amounts of radioactive substances have been released. More than 100,000 people have been deprived of their homes. Around 10,000 people, 10 million people are living in an area that would have to be defined as a radiation control area in a different environment. And this situation will stay with us for many more decades. In the case of Unit 4, as I said earlier, it was not in operation, and the reactor core did not melt down. However, there was a large amount of spent fuel in the spent fuel pool, and the pool became suspended in midair because there was a need to fix the situation. Last November, TEPCO started some work, and finally, on November 4th, the spent fuel that was at the bottom of the spent fuel pool was transferred to the shared pool next door. And this was a great relief to me. If there was a massive aftershock, then that reactor building might have crumbled. So I had been asking desperately for the spent fuel to be removed, and TEPCO finally reacted. So I believe that in the case of Unit 4, we have at least overcome any major crisis. And now to explain more specifically what is currently being done. This is Unit 1. As I said earlier, the reactor core has melted down. It has gone through the reactor pressure vessel and the containment vessel, and it has fallen through. We must make sure that there is no further melting, so TEPCO has continued to pump water into the reactor. There is still spent fuel in the spent fuel pool in Reactor 1. So again, in this case, they have continued to pump water into the pool as well. Units 1, 2, and 3 are all undergoing the same remedial fixes. They are continuing to pump water, but the bottom of the containment vessel has fallen out, meaning that water is now leaking out of the whole area. This is an article from last year, August 3rd. This was an article on Asahi Shimbun, and they're saying that the plan to contain the polluted water is now in a very dire state. And this is true, but the contaminated water issue did not begin in August of 2013. I hope that all of you can fully understand this. If you look at the photograph here, this is a blow-up of that photo. We see Units 1, 2, and 3, and here are the turbine buildings. Outside of the turbine buildings, you see that underground they have these trenches and pits. These are basically tunnels that have been laid out across the property. Inside of these tunnels, there's a massive amount of contaminated water which has pooled. It has been pooling in that area ever since the accident. And
あるいはこちらは2021
May
年
of
ですねの段階で
2013, or I believe here,
地下のトンネルが港に出てくるところから汚染
in
水がジャージャーと滝のように流れているというのを見つけた。
they have actually discovered that water is gushing out like a waterfall from these
ごめんなさい、もうちょっと
tunnels
こういうコンクリート
into the ocean. So let me explain a little bit more. Here's all of the concrete, and then they found a leak
この部分
here.
をコンクリート
So
で塞いで
TEPCO blocked these holes with concrete. They're saying that they've managed to stop the water leaking.
汚染水問題はもう解決してしまったかのよう
The
に
media acted as if the contaminated water problem had been solved. So they stopped reporting about it, but then again, last August, they started saying that there's an issue with the contaminated water. But they have all of these underground tunnels, even the turbine buildings, even the reactor buildings. They're all made out of concrete.
コンクリートって必ずある
Concrete will crack
割れていないコンクリート
for
構造がない
certain. There is no such thing as a
水を
concrete
蓄えようとする
structure without any cracks, unless there is some kind of special measure taken. Concrete cannot be used to fill water. And there's already a massive earthquake in 2011, so it would be a matter of course to think that many concrete structures have already been cracked. So all of these concrete structures, even the turbine buildings, already have cracks. Even if you plug the holes there are many more concrete structures underground that people cannot see, and I'm sure that there are cracks there. So I believe that contaminated water has continued to leak ever since the accident. Now, this is the leak that I was talking about earlier. There was water gushing out of this hole into the ocean, and they tried to stop this by filling it with concrete, but they haven't been able to stop the same kind of leakage in other areas, and therefore I believe that contaminated water has continued.
So what is the current situation?
ここが原子炉
This right here is the reactor.
この原子炉の中に
And within this
毎日
reactor,
400トンの
every day,
水を注ぎ込んで
the injection of 400 tons of water is undertaken into this reactor. As I said, containment and pressurized vessels are all broken, and so there is a leakage towards outside.
中に流れ込んでいる
And also there is a reverse flow of contaminated water that is coming into the
この800トンの水を
to the facility, to the building as well. Of that, 800 tons of water is collected by the TEPCO, and where removal of cesium is undertaken through various devices. But the remaining water is completely unattended. Regarding cesium, some of the cesium within the contaminated water is removed, and 800 of those are recollected. But the remaining 400 tons of water, as I said, cannot be treated, so they are just collected in a tank.
そしてどんどん溜まってくるわけですから
Which means that there is accumulated contaminated water on tanks. As of last year, September last year in 2013, already 433,000 tons of contaminated water has been collected within the facility, the premise. Furthermore, 400 to 600 tons of water, the contaminated water, is overflowing directly into the ocean, feeding into the ocean directly according to
だか
TEPCO.
らどんどん水は漏れていくんだ
As I said, there is a possibility of leakage of water, contaminated water, which means that the entire premise within the Fukushima power plant is basically like a pond of contaminated water, and it is impossible to prevent the contaminated water from overflowing into the Pacific Ocean, and that is what's currently happening. However, that said,
少しでも溜めなければいけない
it's needed. The effort is necessary to try to keep and collecting these contaminated water. That's why the tanks are being built. Where are those tanks? This is the aerial picture of where the tanks were built. The first 2, 3, 4 units, as you can see on this side, as indicated by the arrow. On the northern part, you see the unit 5 and 6.
幸いなことに
Unit 5 and 6, luckily,
1機だけ残ったら
had only one diesel emergency power feed, which thus enabled these 2 units to prevent such disasters. And right here, the numerous tanks has been constructed in order to contain the radioactive water. But as you can see, this is the entire premise of Fukushima Daiichi, which means that there is a physical limit to how many tanks you can construct in a very perhaps near future. There will no longer be any space left for further tank construction, and the contaminated water must be released into the ocean, I believe. This is a picture of the tanks that have been constructed. These tanks were actually made quite in a rushed manner. There was no time for welding these individual tanks. And in fact, the whole area is already contaminated. For any kind of work that is undertaken there would face personnel and workers with the risk of irradiation. So that is why they have a rushed method of tank construction, not of welding, but just using bolts to connect the plates. That's reported by the media, and maybe you might feel that why don't they build a better tank? Well, if you were to build a better tank, a more sturdy tank, that would cause irradiation of the workers and construction workers. But then I believe there will be further leakage going forward. Now, I just described the whole premise as a pond of irradiated and contaminated water. TEPCO, on October 13, 2014, sampled water from a well. And this is what they found. They found 61,000 becquerel per liter of cesium-134, which is record high. As for cesium-137, it was 190,000 becquerel per liter, another record high. As for the total beta, it was 7.8 million becquerel per liter, which is another record high. Well, according to the law in Japan, the limit, the threshold for releasing radiation into the atmosphere, into the nature, in case of cesium-134, is 60 becquerel per liter, and for cesium-137, it's 90 becquerel per liter. As for beta, well, I believe it's mainly strontium-90. In case of strontium-90, the limit, upper limit for releasing to the air is 30 becquerel per liter. So you can see that compared to these emission standards and emission threshold, we have seen the existence of these radioactive substances everywhere within the Fukushima facility, in wells and in other places. The situation currently is that nothing can be done. So what should be done? I believe that we should give up on cooling using water as coolant. So far, in Japan, although this is a foolish situation, Japan has constructed numerous nuclear power plants, and this has led to the accident. But had there not been any accident, the fact that we are running nuclear power plants is that we are generating radioactive substances which are accumulated. Since we started in 1966, the first nuclear power plant, we have generated 1.2 or 1.3 million times the atomic A bomb in Hiroshima. That has been the accumulated radioactive substances since 1966. What Japanese government is trying to do is to just bury them underground. They call this the ground treatment of the burying, creating a pit that is about 1,000 meters in depth. And Japanese government thinks that the only possibility, and by the way, this is legislated, is to bury it underground. Where could be a possible site for such kind of pit? Somewhere where there is no groundwater. if there is radioactive substances and if there is groundwater system, then that would actually contaminate the groundwater. So only way of separating radioactive substances from the environment is separating that from the water and water system. But however, that has been the thinking of Japanese government up until now. However, after March 11th, what Japanese government has been doing is to inject water as coolant. That is, in principle, something that should not be done. Right after the accident, because of the enormous decay heat, in order to prevent the accident from spreading further, only thing that could be done was to inject water as coolant. Right after the accident, if they could not find water, then maybe seawater or any kind of water should be injected, and that's something that I have requested myself as well. But that's no longer the situation now. Well, decay heat is emitted from the fuel itself, but the thing is, it can be distinguished and separated into different types of radioactive substances. Some of the substances that has a shorter half-life have already completely decayed, and this is the flow, the line, the graph that demonstrates the decay. On the very top, you see the in the blue line, the decay heat inside the reactor in Unit 3. Right after the accident, it was about 7 megawatt per hour of decay heat. However, it has, as you can see here, gradually been decreasing, and 3-4 years after the accident, now we were at 0.3 megawatts. We have seen such decline. So perhaps about hundreds of units of home heaters equivalent is the situation of decay heat within the inside of the reactor unit 3. We are still injecting water here, and more water we inject, the more contaminated water we will end up with, which will really put us into the corner. I believe that we should no longer undertake such water coolant method, and I'm proposing another way of cooling the reactor, which is the metallic coolant with a low such as leads. And maybe air cooling could be also a possible cooling method in case of a very low decay heat. But in any case, we should find alternative to water cooling method. Now, I'd like to talk a bit more about the spent fuel pool. In case of Unit 4, the fuels were not in the reactor core, but it was here in the spent fuel pool. And we have been using Kirin or the giraffe in order to cool and inject water into the spent fuel pool. But they were concerned about the status of the pool itself, so therefore TEPCO since last November, has been trying to remove these spent fuels to a different location. Right after the accident in March 11th, TEPCO undertook reinforcement of the structure of the spent fuel because it was suspended after the explosion. So, because the external wall of the Unit 4 was no longer there, it was possible to observe the spent fuel which was suspended into the air. So that's why the TEPCO has started to inject and place steel rods from below. As you can see 4 lines right here. But only reinforcement that they were possible was for the inside 2, and the external 2 rods were not able to be reinforced. In any case, the TEPCO has injected concrete in order to reinforce this whole area underneath. So which means that you can see the more how it was on the English version of the presentation here. Why was it the case? This is the diagram that was actually shared by TEPCO. They have built and placed a steel support and placed concrete placement for further reinforcement. But the whole area of here is already destroyed and damaged. Well, because it's already damaged, and no matter what steel support you place, you cannot support it. So what they could do was to place a very thick concrete. Well, they were able to reinforce only the place where the concrete wall is protruding. which means only 50% of the spent fuel pool has been reinforced, but which means that the remaining 50% is unattended and suspended. This is a very risky situation. That's why finally TEPCO started working last year, and finally they've completed in removing these spent fuels to a different location. This is how they worked. This is Unit 4, and as you can see here, before there was the top floor of the Unit 4 building, but that's no longer there. And this is the lower floor of Unit 4, where you see that the wall, the external wall, is basically gone, and the pool is right here. It is covered with a sheet, so you cannot see the water, but this is where the pool is located. And so in a way they removed the whole top floor. Why? Because they needed to, well, pick spent fuel within the pool, but they could not put it, take it into the atmosphere because people around it would die. So first of all, they would sink 100 tons worth of containers made of lead into the pool, and underneath the pool, they would replace the spent fuels into this lead container, and eventually, once that is complete, they would need to raise the lead cask from the pool up. But of course, it is extremely heavy at 100 tons. Enormous crane is necessary to lift it up. But all the cranes had been destroyed around. So first that they need to place an enormous crane on top of this facility. So what they did first was to remove the top floor and top walls of the Unit 4. And in more details, that this is what they did. They have removed the top floor, and from the side they have placed an external building as such from the side, and this is where they have placed the crane, which would be lifting up the spent fuel in the cask. And that has been the work that has been completed, and it was announced in the media that on November 2014, they have finally finished removing highly radioactive spent fuel from the reactor core.
Please remember that Unit 4 is not the only unit that had spent fuel. There's spent fuel in Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 3. And in the other reactors, the building has been so heavily contaminated that even to this day, people are not able to get close. And somehow, they need to find out a way to remove the spent fuel rods from those pools as well. And then if you look at the environment, as I said earlier, vast areas of the land are now the equivalent of what I would consider to be a radiation controlled area, and yet people continue to live there. I'm sure that they're all terrified. Nobody thinks that it's reassuring. Everybody wants to try to limit their exposure to radiation. So then they want to try to decontaminate. But in Japanese, we say removal of contamination. That's how the kanji characters are written, but the source of this contamination is radioactive substances. Humans cannot eliminate radioactive substances, so if you think about it, then decontamination is absolutely not possible. The only thing that you can do is to take the contamination from one point and remove it and move it to another. That's the only thing that you can do. So instead of saying decontamination, I prefer to use the word transcontamination, transfer of contamination. But people feel like they have no choice. They want to remove the contamination from their own backyard. They want to make the school grounds as clean as possible. And people are doing all of this transfer of contamination, but there's such a limit to what you can do, maybe around your house, maybe around the school. You can't really transfer it in your fields, and obviously you can't transfer contamination in the mountains or in the forests. But people are trying to do that at least around their residences, and look at the amount of waste that is already accumulated. These are flexible container bags, and people are filling these flexible container bags with dirt and with leaves, but they're very fragile to begin with. So look at the state that they are in now. They're starting to rip and tear, and now radioactive substances are again leaking out. TEPCO knows that they cannot leave the situation untended, but there are loads and loads of areas like this in Fukushima. These temporary put-down areas are numerous across the area. TEPCO and the government are planning on building an interim storage facility, but I do not believe that that is the right thing to do. To create an interim storage facility for each of the municipalities, that's not right. The content of these bags, they're radioactive substances, cesium, etc., all kinds of radioactive substances, and the source is TEPCO's Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant reactor, meaning that these are all the possessions of TEPCO. TEPCO had an accident, and then these substances were spewed across the area. The local populations had to collect them, and now they have to continue to live with it. I do not believe that that's right. This waste should be returned to TEPCO. I believe that everything that has been collected in this way should just be sent back to TEPCO, because if you think about the principle, they should be returned to Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. But today, many workers are battling radiation. They are risking radiation exposure while doing their work on this property. So I do not believe that it is possible to send this waste to Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Now, if I say this, I may make some people angry, but I think that this waste should be taken to TEPCO headquarters in Tokyo, because I want the people who are the most responsible for this accident to understand what this entails. But not many people agree with my plan, so then my backup idea is to store it instead at the Fukushima Dai number 2 nuclear power plant, because this is next to Fukushima Daiichi NPP, and they have a big site. They have 4 reactors that were in operation. TEPCO is trying to get these 4 reactors online again, but I say to them to please cut it out. They have caused so much damage, and to think that they should emerge unscathed is unpermissible. I believe that Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant should be the destination for all of this waste. So Fukushima Daiichi NPP should, I believe, become the waste storage site. So in my presentation, up to this point, I've talked about what has happened to date. Now I'd like to talk about what we can do in the future. In the spent fuel pools, there is still spent fuel rods, and we must do everything possible to transfer them to a safer place. We see reactors number 1, 2, 3, and 4, and a breakdown of the number of fuel assemblies. Number 1 has 400, number 2 and 3 have 548 fuel assemblies each. These have all basically melted. In the case of number 4, there were no assemblies in the reactor core. They were all in the spent fuel pool. Now that they have finally all been moved out, that brings us to where we are at today. In number 1, in the spent fuel pool, there's 392. In number 2, there's 587 fuel assemblies. Number 3, 514 fuel assemblies. Even today, nobody can get close to these pools. work, there's been some amount of work that has progressed at number 3, and do you understand why it's possible to work on number 3? It's because of the explosion. The walls have been blown off and they were able to access it. They've been able to remove the walls. But at reactor number 2, the facility walls are still intact, so they cannot get in. Number 1 reactor, they were able to see from the outside after the walls had blown off, but then TEPCO built a wall around it, a cover around it, so now they are no longer able to do any work there. The only building they're able to work on is number 3, and they have been dismantling the building from the top. People cannot gain access there, so they are using remote control construction equipment, but it's very difficult to remote control construction equipment. Sometimes the steel has been dropped into the spent fuel pool, but while going through these difficulties, they are still trying to prepare for the day when they will be able to remove the spent fuel to a different place. We saw earlier that for number 4, they actually built a huge structure that would accommodate a crane, and only after that they were able to do the work. So we have no idea how many years it will take to just get to that point. And then even after we finish work on number 3, there's still Unit 2 and Unit 1. So there is still a tremendous amount of extremely challenging work that will continue on for a very long time. And the biggest issue is the fuel that is melted down. What do we do about that? So in this diagram, we're depicting what happens to the melted-down fuel. The fuel rods melt, and then the baked uranium pellets will start to fall down, and even the broken pieces of the fuel rods will collect at the bottom. So all of that will start to collect here at the bottom of the vessel, and what happens is, here's the pressure vessel, which is made of steel. Steel starts to melt at 1400 to 1500 degrees. So the pellets that are already 2800 degrees are falling to the bottom. So the containment, the pressure vessel will start to break. But there are other issues as well. You see these lines, they represent pipes. You can see that here. This is the control operating mechanism. So at the very bottom of the pressure vessel, there are many pipes that penetrate through the vessel. The control rods are made of stainless steel and they're very thin. But either way, these are skinny pipes and they are going to melt at around 1000 degrees. So regardless of whether the pressure vessel actually melts through, these pipes have already melted due to the high temperature and they've all fallen further below. The reactor core, which has melted down and fallen to the bottom, TEPCO is saying they will pull it out. And I think this might be a little bit hard to read, but basically the work is outlined here in steps from the top, left to right, middle, left to right, and then bottom, left to right. So ultimately, they are saying that they will be retrieving and pulling out the melted core. This is their roadmap, and I will briefly explain this because it might be hard to read. So here's the current state. The melted core is stacked up on the pedestal, kind of like buns or cakes, pieces of cake, according to TEPCO. And water is leaking through because of the holes in the walls. They will send in a robot to find where the holes are. And then the holes will be repaired and plugged. And then once the holes are repaired, it will be possible to fill the containment vessel with water. Once they are able to fill the containment vessel with water, they will be able to remove a sample piece of the melted core to see what state it is in. And the broken parts of the pressure vessel will be repaired. And then ultimately they will fill it to the very top completely with water and then put in a device at the bottom that will pull out the core. So the fuel that is piling up on the pedestal will ultimately be pulled out, according to TEPCO. But I believe that this is nowhere near feasible because it would be challenging enough to try to find the broken parts and then trying to repair that. I have no idea how much irradiation that would entail. And then to continue this kind of work while doing repairs simultaneously is just not possible. And even if they were able to get to this step, here they have another spent fuel pool. And if you are at the top and look to the bottom, that's 30 meters deep, maybe 40 meters. How could one possibly pull something out from that depth? I just do not think that that is possible. And here's the Fukushima Minyu newspaper, and the heading here reads that pieces of this may be scattered on the bottom of the containment vessel. Now, they believe that the fuel is stacked up. TEPCO believes that the fuel is stacked up like pieces of cake on the bottom of the pedestal, but here in the article they're saying that that is not the case, that it's basically just scattered across a much wider area, and I think that that makes sense. Here's the part that they're calling the pedestal. This is an open space, and then if you were to cut a section sideways here, then here is the containment vessel, and then this smaller circle here is what we are calling the pedestal. The control operating rods have to be maintained and inspected, so in a portion of the pedestal, they have an access hatch. So the fuel that is dropped, that is melted and fallen to the bottom, I believe has gotten outside through this access hatch. And what this is showing is that the melted fuel is in contact with the steel here. And this is actually a paper from an American researcher, but I believe that the containment vessel is melted through because of that. I do not believe that the melted fuel is here anymore. Even if you try to look down from the top and try to pull it out, it's no longer there, so you would not be able to do that. At least that is my assumption.
So irradiating so many workers and liquidators, and at the end of the day, after so much effort, they might not be able to retrieve anything, and I think that would be a foolish decision that should not be taken, I believe. So what should we do? I believe that the option that should be taken without any other better options is to create a sarcophagus structure that surrounds the entire building, which was done in Chernobyl. I jumped page. After the Chernobyl accident in 1968, what the Soviet Union and Soviet government did was to create a massive structure, a concrete structure, sarcophagus, that covered the entire building in order to prevent the scattering of the radioactive particles. And through these measures and through other measures, they have, well, having tried other measures, they have finally came up with this decision. However, already after decades after the actual accident, the sarcophagus is destroyed. What they are currently trying to do is to create another facility that covers even the first sarcophagus, which is what this one looks like. European nations are also supporting and helping the Russian government, the Ukrainian government to create this external straight structure. Rail has been established to move construction materials in order to construct this. This is the final image of what it would look like. The initial sarcophagus is inside, and covering that, you have this massive structure. In terms of the lifetime of this second new sarcophagus, it's said that it's going to be about 100 years, but I am quite doubtful that it will last 100 years. But it seems like there are, this would be the only option possible. At Fukushima, when we think about what we should do in Fukushima, as I said before, first of all, the spent fuels that are in the spent fuel pool must be retrieved no matter what. Without doing that, we will not be able to place a sarcophagus, so that spent fuel must be retrieved. But how many years would it take? Could we complete this in 10 years? It will be extremely time-consuming in any case. And after that, what should we have to decide about what to do with the molten core. According to the TEPCO's roadmap, it would take another decade. But I believe that they will not succeed in removing the molten core. They probably would need to result in the sarcophagus building. But in order to construct the sarcophagus, would it take 20 years or would it take 3 years? I don't have that answer. I probably believe that I will no longer be alive to see the sarcophagus covering Fukushima plant. But even with the successful construction of sarcophagus, we will not. It has a lifetime of 20-30 years or so, which means that the second sarcophagus must be constructed on top of it. But I'm wondering if there's anyone in this venue here, within the audience, who would be able to see the construction of the second sarcophagus. That's the time frame we were talking about. And after the second sarcophagus construction, even if that lasts 100 years, we have to come up with another measure yet in 100 years' time. And we might be talking about, well, third generation from now, my grandchildren, my grand-grandchildren, who still need to live with the accident at Fukushima. I have taken up so much time, but I have explained and talked about what has happened until now, what is currently happening, and what is awaiting us going forward. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Oide. I would like to use the remaining time to receive questions from the audience. If you have questions in English, please raise your hands and use the microphone, and we will provide consecutive interpretation. Any questions? Please wait for the microphone. I came from Sendai this morning. My name is Kawakami. I am a secretary working in a secretariat helping and supporting people in Fukushima. My question is the amount of the radioactive substances that were scattered. You only talked about cesium, but even in Sendai, which is quite near the Fukushima, we are kind of forgetting about the accident. The risk of sense of awareness of the risk is fading, and that has to do with Geiger counter. The level that is shown on the Geiger counter is quite low now, and that makes me happy. But if I study further, only certain substances can be measured on the Geiger counter. Certain substances are not detected. So then what should we do? Even if we study, and we only talk about cesium-137 in terms of in comparison with the Hiroshima A bomb. And what should we do with alpha and beta? What should we do with alpha and beta is my question, and how should we understand the situation? So far, I have been saying that 120 types of substances exist. There are alpha and there are beta emitting radioactive substances. So I think your question is a very, very good one. But that said, if you're talking about the atmospheric release of radioactive substances, those that are or gas, all gas has been already released. And the ion has also been released as well, and with a very short half-life. So that's not an issue anymore today. So what we should be concerned about now is cesium-137 and strontium-90, as well as a part of plutonium as well. And tritium as well. I believe these are the 4 substances we should be concerned about currently. As for the radioactive substances that were released in the atmosphere, if you only focus on that, strontium-90 is about 1 in 1,000th of the amount that was released, and plutonium has been that's even much less, to 1 in 1,000th of the strontium. So, of course, it is a highly harmful substances, but the actual amount that was released into the atmosphere was very low when it comes to plutonium and strontium. So we need to really think about cesium. Well, what is the case? Well, cesium is quite easy to evaporate, so that's why it was massively emitted. That is not the case for strontium and plutonium. In case of strontium, it is actually soluble in water, and that goes for cesium as well. So, in terms of the contaminated water that we are struggling with in Fukushima, there is quite a lot of cesium. There is quite a lot of strontium-90 as well. And as I explained before, nothing is done regarding this contaminated water and being released into the ocean. So when we think about the contamination of ocean, we should not only, of course, focus on cesium, we have to think about strontium-90. Maybe this sounds like an excuse, but strontium-90 only emits beta. So, however, it takes enormous amount of time to analyze and measure strontium-90. Cesium turns into gamma, so it's easily detectable, comparatively speaking. That is not the case for strontium-90. It's time-consuming and requires enormous effort to measure. That's why it was not able to do until now. That's why we don't have a reliable amount of data regarding strontium-90. But as I said before, if we were concerned about the ocean contamination, strontium-90 cannot be ignored. And accurate measurement should be taken of this substance as well. Unfortunately, that is not the situation right now. We need to work and lobby the government and local government as well as the companies in order to gain this data. It's impossible for ordinary citizens like you to take the measurement of strontium-90. That is impossible. Therefore, government needs to be mobilized. And any other questions? This person on the third line? Thank you very much for your presentation. I feel that even there is more burden of precious information. On the information regarding the information on the internet, well, I read on the internet that cesium is being detected in the drinking water and tap water, and that's the result of the recent test. And I would like to understand why this is happening and what does this mean. Regarding tap water, cesium level increasing on the tap water, I don't have that actual data, so I cannot answer in an accurate and scientific manner. But please think about this in a more general term. Environment is all connected, and the contamination is shifting as well. So as I showed on the map, there is an enormous amount of contamination in the Fukushima, in Nakadori as well. Nakadori has a river running, a large river that is running from south to north called Abukuma River, which is actually goes into the Miyagi Prefecture and then eventually into the Pacific Ocean. But Abukuma River is extremely irradiated. All the rains and all the waterfalls, etc., fall into Abukuma River, and it goes through Miyagi Prefecture. It goes through the Pacific Ocean. So if we look at the contamination of Pacific Ocean, where is the contamination? Well, Abukuma River and that outlet into the ocean, as well as the entire ocean and coast surrounding the Fukushima plants. And in Kanto region, we have the Kanto flatlands, which actually has various rivers from the many surrounding mountains that is feeding into the Kanto flatland. So that is the flow of the contamination that eventually goes into the Tokyo Bay. So therefore, when it comes to the Tokyo tap water, there is a water treatment center in Wakabayashi for Tokyo. Well, these facilities actually are receiving the contaminated substances from the upstream. So that is why, depending on the weather conditions, for example, there is a different level, fluctuating level of substances, radioactive substances and contaminations in the water. So we need to be aware that even if there is a one-time drop in the cesium level, it could very well go higher.
Professor Koide, thank you for that informative and slightly dismal picture which you painted of Fukushima plant. Vivek Punjab from Sophia University of Journalists from India. My question is two-part. You negated the use of water coolant and you suggested methodic coolant and air cooling. Could you kindly explain a little more, please?
正確に聞きたいので、通訳の方に。通訳。
はい。質問聞き終わってから通訳にしようと思ってます。はい。
Would you like me to repeat?
I think it's okay.
So you mentioned methodic cooling and air cooling as a way of cooling the plant, and you negated the use of water as a coolant. Could you explain why you said that, please? Thank you.
今回の福島の事故での経緯を詳しくまた、振り返るプレゼンテーションをしていただきまして本当にどうもありがとうございます。で、私は上智大学のものなんですけれども、今日まず2点質問したいと思っております。1点目が今後水を冷却剤として使うべきではない、例えばその金属による冷却もしくは空冷はどうかということをおっしゃってましたけれども、その理由について教えていただけますか。
はい、私先ほど皆さん聞いていただいたように水での冷却はやってはいけない。なぜかというと放射能汚染水がどんどん増えてきてしまってそれを対策ができない。
increasing the amount of contaminated water and we are not able to address the issue of the increasing contaminated water. That's why I believe that we should not use water, but we still have to cool the reactors. So what are the other alternatives? One idea that came to my mind was metallic coolant. We could use lead or we could use tin. These metals have a lower melting point. In my mind, what I'm thinking right now is we could create small balls made of these metals and fill the reactor with these tiny balls or pellets. I believe that these small balls would reach the melted core. The molten core is emitting heat, and I believe that the metal will melt, and so we can continue to fill the reactor with metal pellets, and we will eventually continuously be able to cool the molten core, and the containment vessel is actually quite large, so I believe that eventually it will build up so that we will be using the entire containment vessel to diffuse the heat. I'm not sure if this will actually happen, but that's one of the ideas that I have. So I'd like to use a metallic coolant or maybe use air cooling, because a car radiator is an air coolant. So if there's a way to use air as a coolant and then to filter that air, I believe to filter and purify that air, it should not be a problem. So that's one of the proposals that I've made. But TEPCO and the government have continued to insist on using water as a coolant, and we have continued down that path up until now. So that's my answer. 2つ目の質問まではごめんなさい、聞いてないんですけど、まださっき1個目で通訳してしまった。もう一回振りますか？ごめんなさい。
言ってください。
Do you want to go to your second question?
Number two question, sir, was you suggested the sarcophagus could be installed below that Fukushima area in correspondence with Chernobyl. In Chernobyl, the ground soil was very stable. At Fukushima, there is no stability of the ground structure because this is all seismic land, and the potentiality of another earthquake of great intensity is very true, which was unheard of in the case of Chernobyl. So the case of the sarcophagus is fantasy and not theory.
で2つ目の質問ですけれども、福島の対策に関しては、チェルノブイリと同じような時間軸での石棺化を考えることになるであろうということをおっしゃっていましたが、チェルノブイリの場合には非常に地盤が安定していました。でそれに対し福島の場合には、地震が起こりうる場所で、さらに今後より大きな地震が起こる可能性もあるわけです。でそういったリスクがチェルノブイリにはなかったので、それを考えますと石棺化というのは実は非現実的なものなのではないかと思います。いかがでしょうか。Perhaps what you say is completely true.
今私たちは人類が経験したことのない事故に立ち向かって
Perhaps what you say is completely true. We have encountered an unprecedented accident because in Chernobyl, only one reactor broke down. And as you rightly pointed out, it was a very stable terrain, which is why they were able to build this gigantic sarcophagus. But in Fukushima, as you saw earlier, 4 reactors broke down at the same time. This is unprecedented for mankind, and as you rightly pointed out, the terrain is not stable. Japan has the most seismic events out of any country in the world. There could be a massive earthquake at any time. So if your question is, could we truly build a giant sarcophagus there? I am not sure. But we have to think of a way to prevent radiation from being emitted into the environment. So of course, if you can come up with a better proposal, then I would love to consider that, and I think that we just need to adopt the best proposal. But in my mind, I believe that we will not be able to ever retrieve the molten core from the reactor. So this is not the best choice, but I believe that that's the only choice we have. And I'm sorry, you may be right, but I feel that this is the only choice. Any other questions? So I'll go to somebody in the front. I've read many of your books, Professor Koide. And of course, having heard your presentation again today, it has made me think that we should never have built nuclear power reactors. Even experts, I think that is explained in a way that even experts will agree. But one thing that I still question is the pro-nuclear camp. They believe that Japan has a very low energy energy sufficiency rate, so they are trying to do something that is produced domestically, but the fuel recycle is not possible. You had explained that in a way that was hard for me to understand from an engineering or technical perspective. So reading your books and having heard today's presentation, I'm still not able to understand why technically it is difficult to do the fuel cycle, including recycling. So the fuel recycling challenges in the technical point of view are twofold. One is the high-speed, fast-breeding reactor. Are we able to create a fast breeder? And then the fuel in this case is plutonium. Even if we're able to create plutonium, would we be able to reprocess it and then actually pull it out? Unless we are able to achieve both, we will not be able to achieve a complete fuel recycling. I believe that due to technical issues, we will not be able to do either. If I were to try to explain this in detail, I would need to have another full presentation like this. You have heard of Monju, the high-speed breeder, which is a prototype breeder reactor. And even Monju is not still operable. Already 1 trillion yen has been spent on Monju, and yet it cannot even light a single lamp. The reason why technically it is so difficult is because they cannot use water as a coolant. Whenever you want to cool something down, I believe that water is the best coolant. The reactors that we have been using up until now, TEPCO uses the hot water reactor, and what Kansai uses is a pressure-added one, but in any case, they both use water because I believe that water is still the best coolant. But in the fast breeder reactor, they are not able to use water as a coolant, and they're trying to use metal. They're using a metal called natrium, and if you put it in contact with air, then it will start to burn. If you put it in contact with water, then it will explode. So I don't believe that that is a good fit with nuclear reactors. The US tried to build a fast breeder reactor. France, the UK, and even Russia, they have tried and failed. I believe that the fast breeder reactor is a fool's dream. And even if that is achieved, you would need to be able to retrieve the plutonium. And I believe that this is not doable. In Aomori Rokkasho Mura, they have a reprocessing factory which they have tried to plan and build for a long time. Plutonium is the material used for an atomic bomb. It was used for the bomb that was dropped in Nagasaki. Because people wanted plutonium, first the US did it, because they wanted something to build an atomic bomb with. So this is a very valuable military technology which cannot be exported to other countries. So each country has to have this as a homegrown technology. Japan is not a leading country in the area of nuclear power because Japan lost in the World War, and until the San Francisco Treaty, Japan was not allowed to do any kind of independent research on nuclear power. So from an international level, Japan is lagging behind in the nuclear power field. Japan has absolutely no homegrown technology for reprocessing. In Tokaimura of Ibaraki, Japan developed a fairly small reprocessing research institute, but this was actually built by France. The US said no, they didn't want to help, but with France's support, we built a small reprocessing factory. And the intent was to learn the technology in this small factory built by France and then build its own reprocessing factory in Aomori. But Even the new factory in Rokkasho was not built by Japan. Again, it was built with support from France, but Japan felt that it was losing face. So the wastewater, they tried to convert the wastewater into glass using an advanced technology, but even that part failed. The government has already spent 3 trillion yen on this reprocessing factory, which is still not operable. This factory is supposed to take waste from regular nuclear reactors and reprocess it, meaning that it would normally use uranium, but the fast breeder will generate plutonium. So that means that the factory would need to be able to reprocess plutonium. Plutonium is 200,000 times more toxic compared to uranium. So it is severely toxic. This reprocessing factory can't even handle uranium, and I believe that it will never be able to handle plutonium, meaning that the fast breeder reactor and the reprocessing, both pillars that you would need for the fuel recycle to work, would not be achievable.
Any other questions? On the second line, second mode. I'm from Nagoya. Regarding this issue, I've not had other politicians, and I have learned a lot, actually, as a politician, about the Fukushima accident. And it's been about 4 years since the accident. And what's unbelievable for me is that you professors are very active, other professors and other experts writing a lot of books. And the media is taking this issue as well. Despite that, the general and ordinary Japanese people, have they really have a further understanding, deeper understanding about this issue, I wonder, regarding the reprocessing and regarding resolving this accident, and regarding the true nature of the radioactivity, regarding the propaganda that is emitted from the government. I'm wondering why the ordinary Japanese people cannot really use their own logic to understand what is true. I'm really wondering why people are not deepening their own understanding about this matter. But I'd like to ask your opinion about this fact. And another question is, despite that the government and TEPCO and other energy power companies are trying to promote the nuclear power despite the accident, and these people who are actually promoting this technology, are they really, do they have a clear idea of what they are doing? Do they think about their outcome and of what will happen in the future, or do they think that they will no longer be alive when they have to take the responsibility? Well, am I supposed to answer all these questions? I believe that not me, but perhaps Tanioka-san, you should have that answer. Well, I have made several comments, and I am completely disappointed of the politics. The politicians, the political leaders are in Japan, I believe, are completely, disappointing. There's scrubs. Despite this serious accident in Fukushima, people still insist that what's most important is economy in Japan, and I cannot think about any other situation but that they're crazy completely. They're out of their mind. I am very extremely disappointed about the politics and the people. When it comes to and also the legal framework as well, when it comes to such an important matter that has to do with nuclear power, there is no situation where if the plaintiffs can win against the government or the party. So previously, I have been involved in this litigation in these cases, but I have been avoiding. However, that was not the case this year. Earlier this year, I was part of the the OE plant litigation, and actually this year in spring, Fukui's district court has come up with an excellent conclusion. And what's important is that people live, and the financial issues is not a matter that the court should handle. That the primary and primordial concern of the court is the life of people, and that was written by the judge at that litigation. So that made me feel that I should not despair easily, that there are much we can do, also from the legal aspect as well. I am currently, as I said, despairing regarding the politics, but if there are people, and there are good politicians who are thinking right, unfortunately, with the next election, we are expecting a complete victory of the LDP. And regarding the recent amendment of the law regarding the state secrecy, which means that if someone speaks out, just like I'm doing myself regarding the nuclear power, maybe I'm punishable by the new law. Mass media is also reticent further and further about reporting about what's happening in Fukushima. That's how it looks like from my perspective. Since March 11, 2011, I have accepted various interviews from various media. Most of the media actually did not end up reporting what I had said to them. But Tademaki Journal within Mainichi newspaper actually was an exception, writing and putting what I had to say on their journal every day, but that whole program actually disappeared now. And I fear that same thing will happen for other media, and the politics is not going on the right direction either. But at the end of the day, this is a matter and that should be shouldered and burdened by the Japanese people. Maybe I should not talk about this, but foolish citizens actually is deserving of a foolish government. Maybe that's the situation that is what we are seeing now, which means that we need to be more intelligent and more wise as an ordinary citizen to put forth a good government. And perhaps that's not a comment that I should have commented, but perhaps you should have. Any other questions? The person in the frontmost row. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to thank you for the presentation. I'm asking a question based on lack of knowledge, perhaps, but after the accident, well, of course, we have faced it with the choice of choosing food and ingredients, and I find myself avoiding the Fukushima ingredients and food crops. But it's true that I'm aware that as a Tokyo resident, I have been using the energy that is emitted and produced at the Fukushima. But when it comes to the food safety, I'm really wondering, of course I'd like to support their farming, but at the same time, if I knew the threshold of how much of our food ingredients from Fukushima is safe and how much can we consume per year, if we know about this, maybe I can choose wisely. And also when we choose food crops, could we have more confidence in the availability, the options that are available in the market? Regarding the food issue, it's extremely important issue. What is Japanese government trying to do regarding this matter? 100 becquerel per 1 kilogram is the threshold that they have placed. So anything beyond that are not sold in the market. That's the restriction that they have imposed. If it's under 100 becquerel per kilo, they are saying that it's all safe, so you don't have to worry about it at all. That's the restriction that they have imposed, which means that the market that are sold in the market in Japan, we don't know how contaminated it is. It's very hard to select among the different options. That's the situation we are currently faced with. But I believe that that methodology is not the right one. For example, in Japan, with the rice that is harvested in Japan and other vegetables that are harvested in Japan, before the Fukushima, the contamination level was only 0.1 becquerel per kilo. Going from 0.1 to 100 becquerel per kilo means that 1,000 times the radiation level, the contamination level pre-March 11 is allowed without any restrictions. I believe that Professor Pukbai and Keys will also talk about this matter as well tomorrow and day after. But the irradiation and contamination accompanies great risk. Of course, 100 becquerel, beyond 100 becquerel is dangerous, but 99, 10, even 5 is risky as well. Even 10 becquerel per kilogram is 100 times pre-March 11. We have to keep that in mind. No restriction imposed on 100 times that level, and feeding that to the inhabitants and citizens is not the right way to do. More accurate measurements should be taken in a more detailed manner, and as the national government's responsibility, that should be clarified. Unfortunately, Japan is a country where such a measure is not taken, and TEPCO is not doing that either. But if we were to test all food that is available from Japan, well, citizens cannot undertake such huge responsibility. That is why government has to create a framework that enables such measurement. And second point, if we can detect contamination, then I believe no one would be willing to intake such contaminated food, and this is quite a reasonable decision. But I think that is not the option that is possible where we stand. Food has the amount of food that could be produced in the nation is limited. The unit is limited, and that has a different level of radiation or contamination from high to low. And if you say that if there's any bit of contamination, then you're avoiding that food, then we will not be able to survive. We will not have enough food to survive as a nation. So this is something that also is very much criticized, but I have a very special suggestion that I am making regarding this matter. Have you seen a movie called The 18-Karat Gold? No? Sorry. No, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the age restriction regarding movies beyond 18 years old. And I don't think that's the right restriction regarding movies. And I believe that similar level should be created for food, for age, based on the age. So based on 60, 50, 40. So if you're above 60, you can eat certain food. If you're above 50 years old, you can eat certain food, and so that we can provide as clean food as possible to the children. And that goes for the food that is provided in a school canteen. We should undertake all possible tests for food canteens to reduce the amount of contamination as much as possible, but that's not what's done. And if we go to the schools in Fukushima, in order to just demonstrate the safety of the food crops there, these contaminated food actually are served firsthand in the canteens in schools. Of course, I am above 60 years old, so I can enjoy and I'm willing to eat the food that is harvested with love by the people of Fukushima. But I think that we need to protect children, and then I think it should be avoided by young people as well. So I hope that young people should select and choose as clean food as possible. But unfortunately, that same level cannot be applied to all people, and furthermore, no one knows the actual contamination level, so that selection cannot be made. So what is really necessary is for the government to take action to really provide a transparent information of the actual level of contamination. That is my answer to you. Any other question? So the lady wearing the black sweater?
今日は非常に分かりやすいお話をありがとうございました。私は仏教徒の立場から脱原発を
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very easy to understand. I'm a Buddhist, and I have been an activist after March 11. We talked about food just right now. I have grandchildren, 5 and 8, and they're always catching cold. So they live in Chiba. I have a feeling that their immune system is really suffering. So I try to watch out for their diet. I have seafood made in Gunma, Ibaraki, Tochigi, and Kanagawa, Saitama, Tokyo. And I wonder if the food, the vegetables are really safe, but I buy them. Meat products I try to get from Kyushu and Okinawa. They're expensive, but I try to buy them for my health. So the vegetables that are harvested around Kanto, I wanted to understand if they're really safe. And I'm also very concerned about water. I live with my daughter in Tokyo. And because I'm concerned about the water, I buy bottled water. But buying the bottled water is very hard too, and it's expensive. So I use a filtered water filter at home, or at least I'm considering installing a water filter at home. But will I be able to remove cesium by using a water filter system? So I wanted to ask about water and then also the safety of vegetables farmed in Kanto. You were talking about consuming vegetables that are farmed in Kanto, and you asked if they were safe, but first of all, let me say that please don't use the word safe, because when it comes to radiation, then even a small amount is dangerous. At least that's my point of view. So when you are working with radiation, safety, reassurance, or no problem, you shouldn't ever use these words. You have to understand how much contamination there is and how much danger or risk there is, and then figure out if you are able to accept that risk. That's the only way to make a decision. And if your question is, how are vegetables in Kanto? I think that they're contaminated, because I showed you a map earlier. The Japanese government has already acknowledged that Tohoku and Kanto are contaminated to a level that I would consider to be the equivalent of a radiation control area. Food is grown from the ground, from the terrain, and if the land is soiled, then the food will be contaminated. But let me say this for the sake of the farmers. Even if the soil is contaminated, the farmers are doing everything possible to make sure that their crops are not contaminated. They're using a zoolite agent so that they can reduce the amount of contamination that reaches the end product. So depending on their efforts, there are probably produce in Kanto that have a lower level of contamination. But if the entire land has been contaminated, then I would be prepared to accept a certain level of contamination in the crops for Kanto and Tohoku. And then if you want to know what to do, then this is the same answer that I gave earlier. But the adults should eat that. Please just think about not giving contaminated food to the children. As for water, and that was a question earlier as well, I believe that the level of contamination fluctuates. We're talking about tap water. Sometimes the contamination level may be lower. At times, I think it will be higher. It's probably safer to be careful, but buying bottled water, if you want to know if that's safe, I'm not really sure, because that water has been transported from somewhere as well. So there's no way of knowing if that water is truly clean or uncontaminated. I'm sorry, but I cannot say yes to that. I believe cesium can be removed if you use a water filtering system. Zeolite or vermiculite is a clay, and by feeding the water through that kind of clay, then cesium will stick to the clay. So I think that the filtering system will be able to remove the cesium. If you want to buy a filtering system, I would look at the substances of the filter. However, I will repeat, there are some radioactive substances that can never be completely eliminated. It is tritium, which is also a form of hydrogen. Usually, hydrogen that is available in the environment becomes water, and tritium is coming out of Fukushima, and it is turning into water, contaminating the environment. Abukuma River is contaminated. I think other rivers and water sources in Kanto are contaminated as well. This cannot be removed no matter what you do. So I think that even the bottled water is contaminated. So I guess the only thing to do is to, you just have to give up and accept. Are there any other questions? This lady there? I am from Tamagawa. There was an announcement recently from TEPCO of the seventh in terms of the profitability, which angered me. And if they had made so much profit, why didn't they use that money to create the wall that is necessary? Initially, they were thinking of removing the contaminated water using a tanker. And I think what you had said also thought about removing water with a tanker. Is that possible? And despite your recommendations, the government or TEPCO is really not moving in that direction. So metal cooling is what you're suggesting. How could we make the government and TEPCO listen to your recommendation? What can we do to make them listen to your recommendation is my second question. Regarding the contaminated water, as I said before, the contaminated water started to be released on the day of the accident on the March 11th, 2011. There has been accumulated in various facilities within Fukushima since that day. In that time, in March 2011, I believe there was some 17 tons worth of contaminated water, and I suggested at that time that that should be moved to a tanker. That amount should be moved to a tanker because the concrete always cracks. And I communicated that to the governments and politicians. And some of the politicians said that they will do so. They will abide by our rule, my recommendation, but they could not do so. So that is why my proposal was not really taken up. I suggested that 100,000 tons initially at that time should be taken by tanker. A tanker should go to Kashiwazaki, Kariba nuclear power plant, another one owned by TEPCO. That is the biggest nuclear power plant in Japan. And there is a contaminated water and wastewater treatment center within that facility
that is, some of them are not used. So I thought that removed contaminated water should be treated there to reduce the burden. That's what I had thought at the time. But I believe there were so many hurdles to realizing this plan. For example, moving the contaminated water onto the tanker and running that on the water probably will be an infringement of the law of the sea. And what happened to the seafarers who need to actually be on the tanker, who will be irradiated? Is that possible? And I suggested that you should go to Kashiwazaki, which is based in the Niigata Prefecture, but Niigata Prefecture accepts the tanker. That was another hurdle. That's why my proposal was not adopted, and we are here today. But I still think that we should undertake this plan even today. If you are involved in the politics and if you are in part influential, I hope that you will take it up. Well, and in 2011 May, I also suggested that we don't even know where the melting core, and if there is a contact with the groundwater, then we will really be in a serious situation. That is why we needed to create a wall, a shield wall, in order to avoid such contact with the groundwater. But that was right before June, where there was a general shareholders meeting for TEPCO, and at that time, that creating and constructing a wall would be too costly, and they will not be able to go through the GSM in June. So that's why they did not do so. Even now, well, they finally decided that they do have to construct the wall, but the wall that they're trying to construct is a frozen ground wall. They would freeze the soil to a freezing level and create a wall, which would be a wall that they need to create 30 meters around and 1.4 kilometers around, and it would not be possible. And I believe that this plan will not come to realization. But despite the fact that this will not be successful, they will be spending millions of dollars, which will just go into the pockets of the general construction companies. I believe that next measure would be creating a concrete wall, which also would be a profitable business for general construction companies. In a way, these foolish and unrealistic plans are being adopted one by one. Rather than choosing these kind of unrealistic plan, they should come up with something that has more probability of realization, including the metal cooling. And had they adopted these more pragmatic or realistic plan, I believe that we would have been in a better situation today, but that has not been the case, and that is a reality we are currently facing. And I think your question is how to overcome the situation right now. Well, I'm sorry, I don't have that answer for your second question. Had I known a good solution to this current state, then I would have done it already. But unfortunately, because I don't have that better plan, I am here talking about the situation with you today. If there is a better solution, I hope that would be promoting no matter what with all efforts possible. But the first step, I believe, is that really the LDP should lose the election that is upcoming.
先生どうもありがとうございます。今の先生の話の中で、私自身は浪江福島の浪江町の出身で被災をしていたんですけど、ふるさとの惨憺たる光景を
But of course, I see my hometown completely ravaged.
浪江町の復興計画の策定委員というのを2年間やりました。
And I was part of the Fukushima or Namie Redevelopment Planning Committee.
先生のような科学者とか専門家をはじめ有識者と言われる方々が
Scientists, researchers, and many
2
intellectuals.
年間その委員会に関わってですね、感じたの
So I
は
was involved in this
専門家とは
reconstruction
どうい
committee
う
for
人
2
たちなの
years.
かとか。
And I started to wonder what these
それがで
specialists
すね、
represented.
結局私は、町民の分断を、
I actually felt that they were divisive for the community. Some are pro-nuclear, so the community would be divided over pro-nuclear, anti-nuclear, or even a divide between the people who wanted to return to their home and those who didn't. I think that this divide was created by these experts. I felt that the experts were the cause of what divided the community, and I'm not sure how much the experts understand what they have done. And I've raised this question at other academic symposiums, but they've never answered this question. In this presentation, Professor Koide, you have clearly said that there are things that you don't know what to do. And I have a strong sense of trust in somebody like you, because I would hope that all experts could be like you. Unless we can overcome this kind of community divide, there is no way for us to truly reconstruct. So, Professor, if you could maybe set up various debates in which you are speaking against people, academics and researchers who take the opposite point of view, well, I would definitely be interested in a debate. If there's a debate anywhere, then I would be happy to come. However, I don't want to go to a phony debate that has been set up by government if it's just to give them a good excuse or a good cover. But as long as it's going to be a debate on equal, fair grounds, then I would be happy to go. Because after Fukushima, I was invited to speak today and I came here, but I have an order of priority for where I will go. My first priority is to go to the territory of the enemy. So if there is anybody pro-nuclear who is willing to listen to me, then I will go. Or for the Namie Reconstruction Committee, if you would like to hear me speak, then I would definitely love to go. And of course, if there's something I don't understand, then I will say I don't know, I don't understand. But I feel that this area is not appropriate for humans to live. And if I say this area should be a radiation-controlled area, then people hate me for saying that. And of course I understand, because even in Namie, there are people who are living in these areas and they've been abandoned by their own country. They've been told, if you want to leave, then you leave of your own volition. But how should these individuals do that? They have no way to leave. They have no choice but to continue to live there. They have no choice but to say, they want to reconstruct. And if that's the case, they want to forget about the fear. People cannot live in fear, so they want to convince themselves that there is no danger. So there starts to develop some kind of pressure that you're not supposed to talk about radiation. If you're in a contaminated area and you start to talk about radiation, then I know in Fukushima, neighbors hate people who say that. And people who talk about radiation are told to shut up. I think that that's very sad. What we need to do now is to take people away from the radiation-controlled areas with the government taking responsibility for their transfer. It's not about, okay, you run away or we'll give you money to move. Rather, making a living isn't just about eating food. You need to have a job. You need to have connections with other people. You need to have your comrades within the community, and that's what makes life worth living. It isn't about each individual making their own plans. We need to take these entire communities and transfer them in their entirety. Only the national government is capable of doing that. But the government has said they can't do that, so they've abandoned these people. If Japan is no longer governed by the law, then if Japan is truly a country governed by the law, then I think that even if the country goes bankrupt, it should still transfer these communities to a livable place. But unfortunately, that is not happening. And now there are these people who are abandoned, and I see that there seems to be a divide occurring between these people, and it's so unfortunate. I know that if I were to speak about my views to a divided community, then I would be hated for that. But even if it's a dreadful fact, I think it's better to know about it rather than not. That's the reason why I would like to share my thoughts with you. And I am sometimes criticized for causing a burden to my audiences, but I think that I have to accept that. I hope that this is a good answer.
小出先生にお会いできて本当に嬉しいございます。で本当に私ももう遺言という感じで何度も喋ってる年齢なんですが福島のことを今日取り上げられてよく分かったんですが仙台原発この再稼働になりましたよね。で日本にはまだまだたくさん再稼働しようという原発政府の方針がございますよね。結局それ再稼働して使用済みになったものを捨てる場所っていうのは本当にあるんですか？地球の上というか日本の上というか。
actually discard or the waste, the radioactive waste that are generated from the power plants. I think there are two issues regarding your question. If we restart the nuclear power plants, then uranium is then which accumulate the radioactive waste, spent fuel, and what can we do with that, the spent fuels? I don't have that answer to that first part of the question. The humanity started running nuclear power plants in 1942, which is 72 years ago. United States wanted to create an A-bomb for Nagasaki, and that's when a reactor started running. And even since that very beginning, they knew that the running of a nuclear power plant would generate massive amount of nuclear waste, and they knew that they have to find a solution to these wastes. So that is why they are trying to detoxify the radioactive wastes. For the past 72 years, there has been research going on about in order to find a way to detoxify the waste, but we have not found a way to yet. If we cannot detoxify it, what can we do? Well, the only solution is to shield that and from the ecosystem, and there are different ways of shielding. For example, well, let's put it in a rocket and put it into the outer space. And do you think that is possible? Often rockets fail and they come back on Earth. That is not possible. Another way is let's bring it to the South Pole and bury it, or let's bring it in the deep water, deep ocean bed. Well, if we fail, then the entire ocean would be polluted, and those who were not even using nuclear power would be contaminated. And again, the South Pole idea was banned according to based on the international treaty. So that is why a underground treatment or segregation is the only possible way that we have in order to treat the wastes by digging a deep hole in the ground. But how long can they do we have to manage such waste? Well, it's 1 million years that we need to actually guarantee the safety of these wastes that are deep underground. There is no science that can guarantee such a management of 1 million years. That's why I have been against such an idea for a long time. And about 2 years ago, the Japanese scientific committee or the conference has been requested by the Japanese government to consider a way for a ground treatment, but that actual science body itself came with a conclusion and recommendation that they should not undertake a ground treatment or ground burying. And I'm wondering, why have you not voiced the same opinion earlier? Why have you gone for decades without opposing the government's plan? Well, that's what I wonder, and I believe that even burying nuclear waste underground is not an option that we should be taking, and at this point I have no answer in terms of the good solution. Regarding the second aspect of the question, which is what we're talking about, not the spent fuel, but the actual nuclear power plant itself, including the containment vessels, including the outer building, all of these nuclear power plant facilities are contaminated. And these are all machineries that will be decommissioned one day, that will stop working one day. And what to do once these machineries stop working is not thought beforehand. We use the keyword decommissioning, but there is no such thing as decommissioning. The fact is that we will stop running a nuclear power plant. That's all it means. But in terms of what to do with the massive construction of the nuclear power plant, that's an issue that we need to deal with for eternity. Nuclear power plant decommissioning would generate about 600 tons cubic meters of waste. Of course, there are different levels of radiation contamination, but according to the Japanese government's plan, they are thinking of categorizing the waste depending on the radiation level. So very highly polluted parts, such as like the pressure, the PV, should be actually buried underground. That's what government is saying, but I'm against it. What to do with the less contaminated parts? If you were to try to control that as a nuclear waste, it would be too costly. So for the less contaminated waste, Japanese government is currently trying to treat that as a general waste. So, for example, a steel that came out from a nuclear power plant, which is relatively less contaminated, if that is treated as a general waste, then the steel scrap makers would be buying that material, and that will be recycled for use in other purposes. For example, as a frying pan that you're using at home, and you know that your frying pan at home, when you keep using it, when you keep cooking it, that frying pan gets less and less effect. Well, that means that the part of the metal is what you are ingesting as you make dinner and eat dinner every day. That's what's happening. And in terms of the irradiation, 10 millisievert per year is the threshold that is dictated by the law, current Japanese law, in terms of treating as a contaminated waste. If that is happening, and if the decommissioning starts in the Fukushima power plant, which means that any waste under 10 millisievert will be circulated around Japan as a general waste. I hope that that will not happen as a reality. But the fact is that in Japan we already have 58 nuclear power plants, and that is a fact. And we cannot avoid from the fact and the task that we have at hand to try to come up with a solution. And my simple answer and suggestion is that we should just create a sarcophagus of these existing power plants, but that will not be for eternity forever. And the nuclear power generation actually poses us with a very difficult issue.
ありがとうございます。私尋ねたいのは都市物の話が出てきましてですね、要するに私は東京にいるからそうなんですが、私の親戚のものは那須にですね、庭の先にこんな大きなゴミタンクがいつも置いてある。なぜここに置いてあるのかといったら、それはもう都知事権がそれにするということを決めているということしか答えがなくて、そういう状態が続いています。で、先ほどの話では、それは
And apparently, the Fiji government has decided had a
東海第二とおっしゃいましたけど、東
So
海
you're
第二で
talking
はな
about
くて福島第
Tokai
二。
actually, I meant Fukushima Daini.
はい。な
Nuclear
ぜ
power
私
plant.
が福島第二にしようと言ってるかというと、
The reason why I think that Fukushima Daini nuclear power plant should be the destination of this type of decontamination waste is because this belongs to TEPCO. TEPCO is the most responsible party for this accident, and I believe that TEPCO should bear the brunt of this. Some of you may not be aware of this, so let me explain. In Nihonmatsu City, there's a golf course, and the Fukushima accident contaminated the golfing course, so they no longer had golfing customers. This golfing course talked to TEPCO and asked TEPCO, or actually, and took TEPCO to court to tell them that TEPCO should be responsible for cleaning the contamination. And TEPCO refuted that, saying that contamination did not have an owner because it was already clinging to the soil there. And I was completely disappointed. TEPCO is supposed to be one of the biggest companies in Japan, and yet they claim to have no responsibility for the contamination that is on somebody's property. And I was enraged. That's why I've been wanting to have TEPCO take responsibility for the waste. The municipal governments, other parties must not accept this type of decontamination waste. It has to be sent back to TEPCO, but unfortunately that is not happening. I'm at a loss as to what to do. If there's a way for all of us to do something with our collective force and make TEPCO do something about this, then I would love to do that. Again, I would like to collect all of that waste at Fukushima Daini nuclear power plant. That has a huge property, so if we could bring everything there, then I think that it would help to resolve a big issue. And if that isn't enough, then we could take the Kashiwa Karizaki power plant in Niigata, because this is actually the largest nuclear power plant property in the world, and I think that we can take all of the debris and waste to this area. That should help to solve the issue. But unfortunately, I cannot do much. So alone, I'm powerless to do anything. The shield, the tanker, the proposal to make sure that school lunches are not contaminated, all of my proposals have fallen on deaf ears, and I realize that it's pathetic to be powerless to do anything, but that also doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do. I hope that we can work together to do something.
So this will be the final question. Please go ahead. The Nuclear Promotion Act came up with various excuses to generate this contamination that we are faced with. And in terms of the argument against that law, we have numerous. In terms of the scenario of what we should say as an argument against the Nuclear Promotion Act, I'm coming up with a list of arguments against. Just to give a few examples, if the government says that nuclear is the cheapest energy, well, of course, it has been proven otherwise. If we were to restart nuclear power generation, then it would be cheaper, that the electricity tariff would go lower. But even at the time when all 54 units were running, if we compare with other markets, we were the third highest in terms of the electricity tariff in Japan, even at that time. And if we ask that question, not many people can answer why. So we need to come up with a list of facts and arguments to convince people. And also, 4 trillion yen of the national budget would be wasted, is what they say. But actually, that's not the case because of the fluctuation of the currency, and because we were buying natural fuels and the resources from abroad, fossil fuel-based energy from abroad, and importing because we don't have the nuclear power, it is a waste of money, is what they're saying. But is that really the case? Well, we can come up with various excuses and other instances where we are wasting the national treasure, national budget. And I can come up with many other examples of the list of arguments that we have come up with. We need to actually accumulate the data and use that as an evidence against our arguments. If we were to stop nuclear power generation, what are the other possibilities? That's what they are saying. Well, look at Germany. In just 10 years, Germany has succeeded in converting 1/4 of their total energy use into the recyclable energy and renewable energies. And look at their population level. And since the feed-in tariff, we have created actually a tremendous new industry within the energy industry in Japan as well. So you can see that some regions that have the nuclear power plants insist that they will not be able to survive without the power plant. Well, it is possible to welcome other industry that can grow tenfold that of the existing nuclear power industry. And that kind of facts are not known by local people, and that is why there are nuclear promoters. But I say, let's look at Germany. Since they have stopped using nuclear, they have created the employment, they have grown the employment folds. If we were to give these kind of facts, then maybe they can realize the actual fact. So then my question regarding natural energy or renewable energy, I read your publications and you don't seem to be so convinced about the renewable energies. But I feel that they have actually the only way forward, from my opinion, is the renewable energies. What do you think? And finally, if we were to restart nuclear power plant, I think we should have about 1,000 monitoring camera inside the nuclear power plant so that we can see what's going on inside. And if that is available and released to the entire public, and maybe that should be the condition of the restart of the nuclear power plant, because everything has been hidden and non-transparent until now. And if the reality is revealed, then the company goes bankrupt. But when it comes to the TEPCO's presidents and the former presidents, they have never actually lost their job because of that. Well, the time is up. I believe you focus on, you're expert in economy, and I'm not an expert in economy at all. But in terms of the cost of nuclear power generation, there is actually a massive data to provide evidence. Ritsumeikan University's professor actually also come up with a calculation of data that was generated by TEPCO to demonstrate how expensive it is. So if we can stop nuclear and if we can go to thermal, for example, of course it's a natural thing to think that the cost will be lower and the tariff will be lower. And if all the accidents and cost of resolving the accidents of nuclear power plant should be added to the tariff that the people pay, then it will be a tremendously expensive tariff. And also, we have the experience in Germany, so I think you are right, and I think that kind of evidence should be demonstrated and shown. And regarding the renewable energies and the non-fossil fuel energies, I'd like to say a little bit. Humanity so far have been trying to gain energy from different ways. First, we were cutting down trees and which was using that to start heat, and then we were coal, and then thermal, and then now we were doing nuclear. Well, these kind of power generation are not recyclable, be it coal or uranium. Of course, these are limited resources that could be depleted one day, so that is not a sustainable method. So renewable energy is, I believe, the only way forward, and that's what I believe. And so as soon as possible, we should remove ourselves from nuclear energy and shift ourselves to more natural types of or renewable energies. However, we should not have an over expectation on the renewable energy either. That's what I believe. It would take an enormous amount of time to discuss about this matter. I personally think that we are using energy too much. There is a way to live well and achieve a good quality of life without wasting too much electricity and energy. And I think we need to create a social structure that enables that kind of living. It's not about finding an alternative of coal, thermal, nuclear, renewable. We should go back to the more basics of how much we need and how can we actually achieve a good quality of life without consuming that much. This concludes the special lecture. Finally, I would like to give another round of applause to Professor Koide, who's really the father of the anti-nuclear movement in Japan, and is really the star and the light of hope for us. This concludes the special lecture once again. And if you are participating tomorrow and day after, please keep your name tags. And tomorrow morning we will start the registration at 9 o'clock. Please bring your name tags and also the brochure that was distributed to you as well. If you are only participating today, please do not forget to return your name tags. Thank you very much. As for today, tomorrow, and day after tomorrow, simultaneous interpretations headsets will be available. We would ask for 1,000 yen deposits. Of course, that will be returned to you once you return the headsets and the views. Looking forward.